Our scripture reading this morning is from Proverbs chapter 30. Proverbs chapter 30, verses 15 and 16 reads like this. The leech has two daughters. Give and give. Three things are never satisfied. Four never say enough. Sheol, the barren womb, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough.
I thought this was kind of a good follow-up to last week's lesson on being grateful and thankful. Think about Thanksgiving and being thankful to God for all the circumstances of our life. But I want to follow that up kind of as we go into this holiday season when abundance and more stuff becomes very often the focus. And I want to talk about this idea of what I call the disease of more, that we always want more, that we never have a sense that that's enough, that I have enough. In fact, I think one of the first times I ever thought about this was actually in kind of doing some financial class. And most people don't have a sense that they have enough money or they make enough money. They always think they need more. And very often, because in finances, very often people have spent everything they have. They spend everything they get. They get loans and they, get more. And no matter how much they have coming in, that's how much they have going out. And so no matter how much you make, there's never a sense that, wow, I've got more than I need. And why does that happen? There are people who make $250,000 a year, and I'm sure most of us in this room don't make $250,000 a year, who don't feel like they have enough money because they spend it all. Who don't actually, very often somebody who makes a lot of money looks like they have great wealth. Might have a really big house. Somebody who makes $250,000 a year probably has a big house, drives some pretty fancy cars, and would look like they have great wealth. And very often might have, a nice boat, big RV, and very often don't have great wealth. Because they're really what they are is more of a conduit of money, not an accumulator of money. Money comes in and money goes out. And so they keep our economy rolling by just continuing to spend it all. But it's the problem of we always think I need more, and we never have a sense that I have everything I need. I am full. And I think it's one of the problems. I think this actually ties into what has been described by studies of social media. That social media, especially for people who consume a lot of it, and our young people, especially from a young age, they're going to have grown up and that's all they will have ever known. For those of us who are old, we're like, oh yeah, I should look at Facebook, huh? People probably posted stuff. Because I, by the way, have all my notifications turned off on that stuff, so I don't get told when people post stuff on social media. They're like, I'm tired of hearing about stuff. But I didn't grow up with it. It's like too much information. I don't want to hear about all that stuff all the time. I don't want to see what you ate for dinner. I don't care. But I'm old. Doesn't matter to me. I've seen hamburgers before that look that good. But our young people, that's all they'll ever know. And very often, our sense of the world around us comes from the media we consume. Hundreds of years ago, all people could consume, as far as media, was written words, descriptions of things, books. But It was also expensive to have books. Not everybody had lots of books. To have a big library of books, you were a wealthy person. And so people very often, one of the reasons why in America the idea of preachers that traveled around on these circuits in big tents became so popular, because it was the news feed of its day. They would travel from city to city, and they would not just preach lessons for a week. Every single day, sometimes for 4, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, people would flock to come, and he would tell stories about other cities, about other places, and then from the Bible. And people were entertained. It was their only real news often of the outside world. That's not what has happened to you and I now. We have access to almost every part of the globe, pictures and video and stories all the time. You think, well, that makes us better. We have more. But it hasn't. Actually, for most people, especially young people, it has driven up unhappiness and suicide. Well, I don't know if it's the cause of suicide, but suicide rates are up. The idea that I'm not good enough, I think, is prevalent in social media. Look what they have. Look at that new thing. Look at that thing they've done. Because social media pictures are not everything about our lives, right? They're not all the bad stuff. Sometimes we say, oh man, this bad thing has happened to us. And we get some, sad, teary-eyed emojis. And it's like, people think, pray for us. But it's not every bad thing that's happened to us. We don't post all the bad stuff. Most people post mostly good stuff. And then what happens is when your friends see you, it's like, wow, their life's awesome. Why is my life so rough? And so young people, for us who are older, I look at that and I know that. And I guess I'm probably not as affected by it because I understand it. I'm only seeing little glimpses, moments. But if you're young and that's all you kind of see of people, that's what you think the world is. And so this disease, this devil-driven idea that you're not enough with just you and God, it eats at us. And I think it's why I call it a disease is because it permeates the whole world. We're going to look at some passages that talk about that. It permeates. It tends to spread. And what's funny is it doesn't spread. This disease doesn't come from third world countries where, they don't have good hygiene. This disease spreads from the people with abundance to other people who want to have their abundance. But very often the people with abundance don't have as much abundance as you think they have. Very often it's a facade. It's an image. It's just a picture. It's a nice car, but still needs to be fixed when it breaks down. And some of the really nice cars break down more than just your average basic Chevy or Ford. And then when you have to fix them, they cost a lot more to fix. Because after all, they're from Germany. And so this concept, it just kind of gets into us. And it isn't just with stuff or money, it's our life. I need a better spouse. I need a better girlfriend. I need better friends. This insidious sense that I'm not fine just here and right now. That I need something more. And this passage, by the way, in Proverbs 30, verse 15, the leech has 2 daughters, give and give. It might be that it could be translated, they cry, give, give. That's what the 2 daughters do. And that there's never any sense that wow, I'm satisfied. I've had enough. I don't need any more. And he goes on as he describes, there are 4 things that are never satisfied, or 3 things never satisfied, 4 never say enough. Sheol, which by the way is the Old Testament term for the realm that all the dead go to. Kind of like that place of the dead souls gathering. Sheol never says, oh, yeah, that's enough. I don't need any more people to come. Death is like, everybody. Keep coming. The barren womb, never had a child. That woman never said, oh, that's enough. Now we know these aren't absolutes, because even the land never satisfied with water. We sometimes see land that's a little satisfied, right? Because then it's all full of water and it just starts getting too full and starts running off and creates floods. But in general, when you start pouring water on dirt, it just keeps taking it, doesn't it? And fire, we've seen this, especially with the fires. If we don't go and put them out, does fire ever go, I don't think I want to burn up that bush. That next bush, no, I've had enough. I don't need to burn anymore. No, it just keeps going. And that's what the Proverbs here are talking to us about. That the danger of us thinking, I always need more. Now I want to look at of never enough. I liked the OU in this little thing up here. You notice that it's infinity with just a little gap in it. The O and the U. It's kind of an infinity symbol. Because it's like the infinite. It's like, can you ever get to infinity? No, but that's sometimes what it feels like. I need more. Now, I want to read one other passage here, Proverbs 27:20. And same kind of idea presented to us there. He says, Sheol and Abaddon are never satisfied. Same thing we read in the other one. And never satisfied are the eyes of man. And that's human beings, just people. People in general are never satisfied and never feel like they have enough. But that doesn't come from God. That comes from our flesh and the temptations of the devil. Because it's not really true. And things that aren't really true, what does that mean? I'm being deceived in some way, aren't I? Look at the next one here. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verse 8. In Solomon's search for the meaning of life on this planet, he went out searching for the purpose, the meaning of what it means to be a human being living on the third rock from the sun. And he said, in this particular section, he is, looking at all the things done under the sun and the vanity that's done under the sun. He says, one person who has no other. So he's just describing a particular scenario. Here's this person, doesn't have anybody else, just themselves. No, don't have a son or a brother, yet there is no end to all his toil. And his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? He says, this also is vanity and an unhappy business. So he describes this person who just, think about, so I'm accumulating stuff and I don't have other people I need to give it to. And I've got plenty. The word riches essentially means an abundance beyond what I need. How much is that? Most people don't have any idea of how much abundance is for them. Especially when you talk about finances. And you sit with somebody about financial kind of thoughts, and they never have a sense of what it is that they need and how much is actually more than they need. Because if you were given more, take $1,000 more every month, whatever you have right now. Can you think of ways to spend it? I bet every single one of us can think of ways to spend it. I'd really like that. And if right now you were going to be given, an annuity that gave you $1,000 a month for life, you'd go, I know some things I could do for that. I have things I'd like. Because there is no end to the amount of stuff around us. And there's no sense of, I'm content right where I'm at, in the circumstances I find myself. I want to look at the world in his hands. Does it make you want to sing the song? At the whole world in his hands, right? But this passage I look at talks about it's not God who has the whole world in his hands, it's actually the devil who's got the whole world in his hands. Because he's the God of this world. God doesn't live in this world. God has communicated to this world. He has given to us everything we need to escape the world. But this world is really the devil's. And I want to look at this passage in Habakkuk, because it's kind of interesting that the idea of never being satisfied comes up in this question that the prophet Habakkuk asked God. The background of this, by the way, is Israel is suffering, and the Assyrians, Babylonians, and they are going to be overrun, and they are going to be defeated by people who are more wicked than the Israelites. And so the prophet asks this question to God. Then I want to start reading here in verse 12 of chapter 1. And the prophet is talking to God. He says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why?" So he's kind of setting him up. You are so awesome and so great, and you hate to look at evil. You ever wonder sometimes when a child is asking you, they're kind of buttering you up, "Oh, you're just so good. Oh, you're just so smart." It's like, it's like, what do you want? Well, that's kind of what Habakkuk is doing. He's like, you're just so awesome, and you hate evil and you can't stand it. But so why do you stand by when all this evil is happening to us? Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? That's the question. By the way, everybody has this question. This is a common sense of human beings. When we see really terrible tragedies, sometimes just, environment, floods and fires, different things, and storms, but sometimes from other human beings, just wicked human beings that murder and slaughter, rape and abuse. And we go, why, God? Why do you allow this to happen? All human beings ask that question about their sense of some higher being, whether they're Christian or not a Christian. The idea of thinking about God and God looking at the earth when all of these terrible things are happening, and how can He stand there and look at it? How can He see it? Because He knows everything that's happening all the time. I don't even know how He could probably put up with that, with all the wickedness people do. How does He maintain a sense of goodness? It would be so hard for me to be a witness to all the horrible things human beings can sometimes do to one another. But that's the question He has of Him. He says, you make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. He's talking about people who aren't godly. He's looking at human beings who live in abundance and have all this stuff, and they sacrifice to their stuff. They put their stuff on an altar to worship it. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Now he's probably specifically talking about like the Assyrians or the Babylonians, but that happens to people all the time. The one who is the conqueror, the abuser, who's to stop them? And he says in chapter 2, verse 1, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So he goes, okay, I'm going to stand back and wait for God's response. And the Lord answered him. He said, write the vision. Make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it. He goes, I'm going to tell you a story why all this is happening. And people aren't going to like to hear it. He says, for still the vision waits its appointed time. He says, it's not even come to its completion yet. It's still coming. And he says, it hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him. So he's looking out at these people. He says, they're not righteous. Their soul is thinking they're better than they are. They're not really upright within themselves. They might look like it. Lots and lots of people appear to be righteous who don't have righteous hearts, who don't have righteous intention and purpose. And he says, but the righteous shall live by faith. By the way, one of the most quoted verses, second half of verse 5 there, or verse 4, is one of the most quoted in the New Testament. The idea that the reason we will live is because we trust God. And he says, moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. I want to pause there for a second. Because this passage, by the way, is translated. The first part of verse 5 is translated in a number of different ways. And sometimes they don't really resemble one another. The reason for that, and there's sometimes notes in some Bibles, that says there's a couple lines here in Hebrew that even Hebrew scholars are like, I'm really struggling with its meaning. I don't really know everything that's kind of being talked about here. And so one of the things that's interesting is in this exact verse, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are written, they were copies of the Bible, of the Old Testament Bible by a kind of separatist group of Israelites. And their text does not have wine here. It has wealth. Now, it may be that they were actually giving a bit of a commentary saying wealth. Because what does wine mean? Besides just what wine can physically do to us, what is wine as a symbol? When you think of wine, do you think of a wino, pourer, or do you think of somebody who wants to build themselves a wine cellar? Because typically, a wino is not buying nice wine, right? Wine is a symbol of wealth, by the way. And think about just that for a second. Think about if you didn't have an abundance of food, would you take grapes, squeeze them, and then just let it sit for a while? And for years and years maybe get better and better? Be better and better wine? No, you'd eat it. or you would drink it right away. But when you have an abundance, you can take the crop and you can let it sit for years. Wine is a symbol of abundance. And I think that might be what's happening in this passage. He's talking about this idea of abundance. That it is a traitor and an arrogant man that never rests. He says, and this is the part where I really wanted to hit at, last part of verse 5, his greed is as wide as Sheol. There's that concept again we saw in Proverbs a couple times. His, like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. Now that's probably a specific reference to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar conquering all the nations. But who is Nebuchadnezzar working for? Now God called him, but he called him to destroy nations. But when he did all that evil, because Babylon, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar was punished by God. Babylon was punished by God. Why? Because when they went out and conquered all those nations, they weren't righteous. They didn't do good. They were just gathering abundance and taking for themselves all that they could. God was using them, but they were really people who followed the devil. They didn't follow God. And so, why are people destroyed? Because very often we never have enough. Now, I brought all that Old Testament stuff because I want to bring us to the passage in the New Testament. And what is really our great gain? What does really God want for us? I actually loved this little image of Pooh and Piglet walking down, and what day is it? Doesn't that look like the snow too? They're kind of walking through the snow. Today. It's today. Oh, my favorite day. Just that idea that I'm right here, right now, and this is great. Right where I'm at. Right what I'm doing. I don't need something more. I don't need this. I don't need that. Can't wait till this or that. Today is awesome. And so it's in 1 Timothy, Paul wrote about this in a lot more concrete ways than we're talking about in the old. All of these poetic ways that are described in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and even Habakkuk. Sometimes we read through that poetry of the Old Testament, and isn't it confusing at times? You really have to kind of like figure out the imagery, figure out the point that's being made. It's actually a lot of work in the Old Testament because a lot of times the imagery isn't super clear because it was written at a time and a place that I'm not familiar with. And so in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul writes about this idea of greed, of wanting more, and the dangers of it. And so, starting actually in verse 2, kind of towards the end of verse 2, when he urges Timothy to teach and urge these things amongst the church. He says, if anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the teaching that accords with godliness, he is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. Now, godliness, by the way, kind of sounds like being godlike, right? It's not exactly what it means, though. It doesn't really mean to be godlike. It really means to be devout or devoted to God. Godliness is a sense that I'm devoted to God. And he says that some people, they're religious, but they're really not godly. And so they get puffed up with conceit, and they don't understand things really right. They have an unhealthy craving, he says, for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions. Now, I have had the privilege for many years to teach the Bible to groups of people, and going all the way back into the 80s, before some of you were alive. And one of the things that's often has disturbed me is there have always from time to time disagreements come up when we study and we read through the scriptures. And sometimes those disagreements people get upset because they're all typically emotionally involved in what they believe. But sometimes there are some people that when people are arguing and they're disagreeing and it gets kind of not too friendly, and there are some people who smile, who like it. And because I see, people that sit as students, they don't see it. The teachers can see it. And it's really sad. But to me, it's also like really a danger. Because that's a person who likes to stir it up. I want to stir it up. Because they feel like, and I don't think they're doing it because they're purposely trying to be evil. Very often, I think they've kind of deluded themselves or deceived themselves that this is somehow profitable. That this quarreling is producing something good. And I think scriptures are pretty clear about it. It doesn't. Unless we can actually sit down together and work through our differences in a way with patience and compassion and love for each other, that very often that it really tears people apart. It doesn't build people up, which is the purpose of what we're trying to do together. And so this happens, and I've seen what he's describing happen. He says, "And constant friction among people who are depraved in mind, deprived of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain." They're like, "Oh, I'm going to become a Christian, and that's going to somehow get me some more stuff." That sometimes people think, I'm going to become a Christian, and then everything will be great and fine and wonderful, and I'm just going to have an abundance now because God's going to take care of me. Well, God is promised to take care of us, but sometimes not in the way we would like. And so sometimes the mistake is made that we think godliness is a way to get stuff. But what he says in verse 6, and this is super important, this is the great gain that I'm talking about here. But godliness, being devoted to God with contentment, is great gain. That's great. Well, now what did he just describe this person having? How much stuff do they have? How much stuff do you need to be devoted to God and be content? A lot less than most all of us have. And we forget that from time to time. That this is really the great thing. That when I'm just like, wow, I'm blessed. When we see people who have very little and feel incredibly blessed for what they have, doesn't that make you feel good? Aren't you like, man, I wish I had that? Because it is that sense of contentment that most of us are really looking for. And what we think is the disease of more tricks us to thinking, when I've got more, then I'll be content. Right? Well, if I just get this, then I'll be content. If I only had that, or if I only had these people. Because one of the problems even with people and family, they don't remain static, do they? We maybe we grew up in a wonderful house with our parents, and it's like everything was wonderful and happy, but it doesn't stay that way. They grow older. They're going to pass. And then we're going to have to move out on our own and go without as much. I think it's one of the reasons. This disease of more, I think, is also part of the explanation of why so many younger people do stay home longer, why they come back home after college and stuff, is because they're used to all the comforts of home. They're used to having, the PS4 and the Xbox One, and they're used to having the big flat screen, and they realize when they first get a job that all I can afford is to rent a room in somebody else's place. And it's like, this doesn't seem nearly as fun as mom and dad's house. And so we're always wanting more. It keeps us from realizing no matter where we have right now, as long as we have God, and as long as we can understand that with God we have everything we need, we will be very, very blessed. That's what he's trying to get us to understand. Because he says in verse 7, "For we brought nothing into this world, and we can't take anything out of it. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content." I'm always curious why he left out place to lay your head. That's not in here. Got something to eat, and I got something to put on. He didn't say it had to look great. He didn't say it had to taste great. Yes, he said you had some. And he says, "But those who desire to be rich, to want an abundance, they fall into temptation, into a snare, into this disease, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction." Now think about that. When we see people who are really rich, do you feel sorry for them? Most of us don't. And I've mentioned it in the past a number of times. I had some wealthy family members. So my dad was pretty wealthy when I was little. He lost it all when I was it was a process, but by the time I was in high school, he had lost it all. My uncle, though, on the other hand, was very rich. You know, he in his estate, he left millions and millions of dollars to people. But my dad and my uncle, this passage I get because of that experience. They were very unhappy people. They were very non-blessed people. My uncle especially was very ill towards the end of his life. He had more money than he knew what to do with. You know, he had like 3 or 4 TVs in his room, all, you know, on the same channel, so however he was laying in his bed, he could see the TV. But he had almost nobody that liked him. So most of his money actually went to people who were caring for him at the very end of his life, because they were nice to him at the end. Because most of the people that had been there through most of his life didn't want to be around him anymore. And it was sad. And it was terrible. Money didn't fix any of that. He was what I would describe, exactly what he's saying here. My uncle was at a place of ruin and destruction, who had more money than he knew what to do with. He didn't know what to do with his 2 lake houses. Didn't know what to do with the house he had down in Minneapolis. He didn't do all his cars, business, all the different things that he had. He didn't even know who really to give it away to. And didn't want to give it to people who weren't nice to him. Of course, he had not been nice to them, so it kind of worked both ways. But his wealth had essentially ruined him. Partly because he used it as a lever. His wealth was a tool to manipulate people. And his life became horrible. And so I've not had that sense. I don't always look up to people with money because I grew up with people like that and saw it. I know what he's describing here. I lived a lot of what Paul's describing. What money can do to people. And it can ruin them. And it isn't the money itself, because there are other people who have money who are wonderful people, who are kind and generous and godly with money. But the money isn't the factor. It's really your love of the money. That's the factor. And so that's what he's describing here. He says, that's verse 10, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with pangs." And I just want to come down towards the end, and he tells the rich, I'm going to skip some of this just for time, but he says in verse 17, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Godliness and riches in heaven are far more important than the stuff we have on earth. That's what he's trying to get us to see. And if we understand that, we will be far richer people because of it. That's the gain God wants us to know.